Colorado Territory, 1869. The harsh line between civilization and wilderness had been drawn with blood, sweat, and broken dreams. In this unforgiving landscape, one truth remained constant. A lone soul would not survive long. At least, that's what Frank Jameson believed as he stared across the windswept prairie, his leather-gloved hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. At 25, Frank had the weathered eyes of a man twice his age, though his face still carried the handsome, youthful features that belied the hardness he'd cultivated inside. His light brown hair curled slightly beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and despite the trail dust, there was something undeniably appealing about the set of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders beneath his worn denim shirt. "No room for softness out here," he muttered to himself, a mantra he'd repeated since watching his father's homestead burn to the ground 3 years prior. The flames had taken everything, his family, his faith in humanity, and any foolish notion that the West was a place for tenderness. Only the strong survived, and the strong stood alone. Frank nudged his chestnut gelding forward, following the barely visible trail toward the town of Silverdale. The settlement had sprung up around a small silver strike, not substantial enough to create a boom town, but sufficient to sustain a community of hardworking folk. Frank wasn't looking for community, just work, whiskey, and perhaps a warm meal before continuing northward. Attachments were dangerous, they made a man vulnerable, and vulnerability got men killed in territory this wild. Smoke from cookfires curled lazily against the late afternoon sky as he approached the collection of wooden buildings. Silverdale wasn't much, a general store, saloon, livery, and a handful of homes spreading outward from the dusty main street. Frank's boots hit the ground with a thud as he dismounted, leading his horse to the water trough outside the general store. He'd learned to assess a town before committing to it, even for a night. "You passing through or staying?" the voice came from behind him, steady and neither friendly nor hostile. Frank turned to find a gray-haired man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his chest. "Just passing through, need supplies, maybe a meal." The sheriff nodded. "Thompson's store has what you need. Saloon's got decent stew tonight." "We don't tolerate trouble here." "I'm not looking for any," Frank replied evenly, meeting the older man's gaze. Something in his tone must have satisfied the lawman, who simply tipped his hat and continued his patrol down the street. Frank watched him go, then led his horse to the hitching post and secured him. The bell above the general store door jangled as he stepped inside, the familiar smells of leather, coffee, and tobacco greeting him, and that's when he saw her. She stood behind the counter, slender fingers arranging a display of ribbons, her chestnut hair falling in gentle waves past her shoulders. She wore a simple blue cotton dress, modest but well-fitted to her slender frame. When she looked up, her eyes, a striking hazel that caught the late afternoon light streaming through the window, locked onto his with an intensity that made Frank's practiced stoicism falter. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Frank felt rooted to the floorboards, unable to step forward or retreat. Something stirred in his memory, though he was certain he'd never been to Silverdale before, never seen this woman in his life. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed to float above the dusty stillness of the store. Frank cleared his throat. "Just need some supplies." "Coffee, beans, ammunition." His voice sounded rough even to his own ears. She nodded, but her eyes never left his face. "You're new to town." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Just passing through." "I'm Olivia." "Olivia Zimmerman." She offered the information freely, without the caution most frontier women had learned to adopt around strangers. "Frank Jameson," he replied, despite his rule about keeping interactions brief and impersonal. Something flickered across her face, recognition, confusion, he couldn't be sure. But the way she looked at him, it was as though she were trying to place him in a memory that wouldn't quite form. "Have we met before, mister?" "Jameson?" she asked, her head tilting slightly. "No, ma'am, I would remember." The words came out more earnestly than he intended. She smiled then, a gentle curving of lips that seemed to illuminate her entire face. At 20, Olivia Zimmerman possessed a kind of beauty that had nothing to do with frontier pretensions, and everything to do with an inner light that the harshness of territorial life hadn't yet dimmed. "Well then," she said, moving from behind the counter, "let's get you what you need." As she helped him gather supplies, Frank found himself watching her movements, noting the graceful efficiency with which she navigated the store. There was something about her that seemed familiar, like a half-remembered dream or a tune he couldn't quite recall. "You traveling alone?" she asked as she measured coffee beans into a paper sack. Frank nodded, his guard rising instinctively. "Best that way." "Is it?" Her question was simple, but it cut through his practiced detachment. "Seems a lonely path." "Lonely is safer than the alternative out here," he replied, the words coming automatically, the defense of a man who decided that connections were liabilities. Olivia paused, weighing his words. "I suppose that depends on what you're running from or toward." Before he could formulate a response, the store door burst open, and a harried-looking man with spectacles rushed in. "Olivia. The Rollins boy is hurt bad. Horse threw him against the fence. Your father's asking for you to come quick." Olivia's expression shifted immediately from contemplative to determined. She turned to Frank. "I need to go. My father's the doctor here. I assist him." Without thinking, Frank asked, "Can I help?" The question surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Involvement in local troubles was exactly what he avoided, and yet here he was offering. "Yes," she said simply, as if she'd expected nothing less. "We'll need strong hands." Before he knew it, Frank was following Olivia and the spectacled man out of the store and down the street to a modest white clapboard house with a small sign identifying it as the doctor's residence. Inside, a boy of no more than 12 lay on a table, his face pale with shock, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Dr. Zimmerman, a man with the same chestnut hair as his daughter but streaked with silver, looked up as they entered. "Olivia, prepare the laudanum and splints. You," he nodded to Frank, "I'll need you to hold him steady when I reset the bone." For the next hour, Frank found himself part of a well-coordinated team. Olivia moved with practiced precision, anticipating her father's needs, her face composed despite the boy's cries of pain. When it came time to reset the broken femur, Frank held the child firmly, speaking low, reassuring words he hadn't known he possessed. When it was done and the boy had been given laudanum for the pain, Dr. Zimmerman stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Jameson, Frank Jameson." The doctor nodded. "Well, Mr. Jameson, you've got steady hands and a calm head, not qualities I often find in drifters." "I'm not," Frank began but stopped. He was a drifter, had been since the fire. What else could he call himself? "Stay for supper," the doctor continued. "Least we can do to thank you." Frank's instinct was to refuse, to retreat to the anonymity of the saloon, but he found himself looking at Olivia, who was cleaning blood from her hands with practiced efficiency. "Please do," she said, meeting his gaze with that same searching look, as if trying to place a half-remembered face. "I insist." And against every rule he'd set for himself, Frank Jameson heard himself accept. Dinner at the Zimmerman home was unlike anything Frank had experienced in years. The modest house was filled with books, medical journals, and small touches that spoke of a life built with care, hand-embroidered curtains, a vase of wildflowers on the table, mismatched chairs that nonetheless formed a cohesive whole. Over a simple but flavorful stew, Dr. Zimmerman spoke of his practice, how he'd come west from Philadelphia 15 years ago with his wife and infant daughter. "After my wife passed from influenza, it was just Olivia and me," the doctor explained. "She's been my assistant since she was 12, has a natural gift for healing." "Father exaggerates," Olivia said, but her voice carried pride. "I simply do what needs doing." "That's rare enough in this world," Frank found himself saying. The conversation flowed more easily than he would have thought possible. He found himself sharing small, safe pieces of his past, his childhood in Missouri, his skill with horses, even his ambition to one day have land of his own again. He carefully avoided mentioning the fire, his family, or the loneliness that had been his constant companion. As the evening wound down, Dr. Zimmerman excused himself to check on the Rollins boy, leaving Frank and Olivia alone in the small sitting room. "You're good with people," Olivia observed, pouring him a cup of coffee, "despite your best efforts to appear otherwise." Frank couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. "I used to be." "Before." "Before what?" she asked, settling into a chair across from him. The question hung between them, an invitation to share the burden he'd carried alone. Something about Olivia Zimmerman made him want to trust, a feeling so foreign it nearly frightened him. "Before I learned how quickly everything you care about can be taken," he finally said, the words feeling rough in his throat. Olivia's eyes softened with understanding, not pity. I know something about loss, Mr. Jameson. Frank, he corrected. Frank, she echoed, and somehow his name sounded different in her voice. I lost my mother when I was 5. I still remember her face, her voice. Sometimes I dream of her, and in those dreams I know her instantly, even though in waking hours her features blur in my memory. She leaned forward slightly. When you walked into the store today, I had the strangest feeling, like I was recognizing someone from a dream. As if I knew you, even though we've never met. Frank's heart beat faster. I felt it too, can't explain it. Perhaps some souls recognize each other, she suggested, then laughed softly. Father would call that nonsense, of course. He believes in what he can see and touch. And what do you believe? Frank asked. Olivia considered the question, her hazel eyes reflective in the lamplight. I believe there are mysteries in this world science hasn't yet explained. I believe in connections that defy logic, she smiled. And I believe you didn't intend to stay in Silverdale, but something has made you reconsider. The accuracy of her observation startled him. Indeed, as the evening had progressed, Frank had found himself thinking that perhaps one night in town wouldn't be sufficient. He needed supplies, after all. His horse could use the rest. I might stay a day or two, he admitted. Good, she replied simply. Then we'll have time to figure out why you seem so familiar to me. That night, as Frank lay in the rented room above the saloon, he found himself unable to sleep. His carefully constructed defenses felt undermined, not by any external threat, but by a pair of hazel eyes that seemed to see past his practiced isolation to the man he'd been before grief had reshaped him. Foolishness, he muttered into the darkness, and yet he couldn't deny the strange sense of recognition he'd felt, as if he'd known Olivia Zimmerman in some other time, some other life. Morning brought clarity, or so Frank told himself as he saddled his horse. He would purchase the remainder of his supplies and be on his way. One pleasant evening didn't change the reality that attachment was dangerous, that the frontier was no place for connections that could be severed as easily as a lariat. He led his gelding toward the general store, intending to complete his business quickly. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As he approached, he saw a commotion. A wagon had overturned, spilling lumber across the street. Men were working to right it, but one beam had crashed through the general store window. Frank secured his horse and moved to help without hesitation. Inside the store, he found Olivia sweeping up broken glass, a small cut on her cheek. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crossing to her immediately. She looked up, surprise and something warmer flickering in her eyes. "Just a scratch. I was shelving near the window when it happened." Frank pulled out his handkerchief, stepping closer. "May I?" She nodded, standing still as he gently dabbed at the small cut. Her skin was warm beneath the cloth, and Frank was acutely aware of their proximity, of the light floral scent that seemed to surround her. "I thought you might have left already," she said quietly. "I was going to," he admitted, lowering the handkerchief, "but it seems Silverdale isn't done with me yet." A smile touched her lips. "Or perhaps you aren't done with Silverdale." The next few hours dissolved Frank's plans entirely. He helped clear the debris, board up the broken window, and reorganize the merchandise that had been disturbed in the accident. Working alongside Olivia felt strangely natural, as if they had done this many times before. They developed an easy rhythm, anticipating each other's movements, their conversation flowing from practical matters to deeper subjects without effort. By mid-afternoon, when the store was restored to order and the last customer had been served, Frank knew he wouldn't be leaving that day. "Have dinner with us again tonight," Olivia said as she locked the store door. "Father enjoyed your company, and I—" She paused, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I would like the chance to continue our conversation." Frank nodded, surprising himself with how easily the acceptance came. "I'd like that." Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Frank found odd jobs around town, helping at the livery, assisting with repairs at the church, even aiding Dr. Zimmerman with a difficult birthing at a nearby farm. Each evening, he joined the Zimmermans for dinner, and afterward, he and Olivia would talk well into the night. She told him of her dreams to expand her father's practice, to bring modern medical techniques to the frontier where they were so desperately needed. He shared stories of his travels, the landscapes he'd seen, the people he'd met. But always he skirted around the central tragedy that had set him on his wandering path. Until the fifth night when they sat alone on the porch, the evening air cool around them. "You're running from something," Olivia said softly. It wasn't an accusation, merely an observation. Frank gazed out at the darkening street. "Not running toward something." "Perhaps both," she conceded. "But there's pain behind your eyes, Frank, the kind that comes from loss." He was silent for a long moment, watching the first stars appear in the twilight sky. 3 years ago, my family's homestead in Kansas was burned to the ground. My parents, my younger sister, they didn't make it out. The words felt raw, exposed. I was in town selling horses. When I returned, there was nothing left. Olivia's hand found his in the gathering darkness. Who did it? Land grabbers. The territory was changing, becoming more settled. Our land suddenly had value to people who didn't care how they got it. His fingers tightened around hers. I tracked them, found them. 3 men. "Did you kill them?" she asked, her voice steady. "2 died in the fight, the third I left for the territorial marshal." Frank's voice was flat. "Justice was served," they said, "but my family was still gone. Our home was still ashes." "So you decided to keep moving," Olivia concluded. "Staying in one place, building something, it just gives fate a target," Frank said, voicing the belief that had driven him for 3 years. "Better to keep moving, keep to yourself." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "And has that brought you peace?" The question hung in the air between them. Frank knew the answer, had known it for miles and months, but hadn't been ready to admit it until now. "No," he said finally, "it hasn't." Olivia's hand remained in his, warm and steady. "My mother used to say that grief is the price we pay for love, that loving and losing was still better than never having loved at all." "Wise woman," Frank murmured. "Yes," Olivia agreed. "Though I think she would also say that while we can't choose when we lose people, we can choose whether to let that loss define our future." Frank turned to look at her, her face softly illuminated by the light spilling from the house windows. In that moment, the strange sense of familiarity he'd felt since their first meeting intensified. It was as if he'd known her voice, her touch, her wisdom in some other life, as if their souls had encountered each other before. "When I first saw you," he said slowly, "I had the oddest feeling that I knew you, that we'd met before." Olivia's eyes held his. "I felt it too, still do." "How is that possible?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but I've learned not to dismiss things simply because I can't explain them." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Dr. Zimmerman stepped onto the porch, peering into the darkness. "Someone's coming fast," he observed, his voice tight with concern. Frank rose, instinctively placing himself between Olivia and the approaching riders. 3 men on horseback pulled up in front of the house, one of them supporting a 4th man who was slumped in the saddle, clearly injured. "Doc Zimmerman," one called out. "Marshal Peterson's been shot. Ambush at Coyote Creek." The next hours passed in a blur of focused activity. The marshal had taken a bullet to the shoulder during an encounter with cattle rustlers. As doctor, Zimmerman worked to extract the bullet and stop the bleeding. Frank assisted, holding the wounded man steady, passing instruments, and following directions without hesitation. Olivia worked alongside her father with practiced efficiency, her hands steady even as the marshal's blood soaked through towels and bandages. When the procedure was complete and the lawman stable, she stepped outside for air, her face pale but composed. Frank followed, concern evident in his features. "You all right?" She nodded, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. "This wasn't my first bullet wound, won't be my last." She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "You were calm in there." "Steady." "Not my first either," he admitted. "During the war, I helped field surgeons when needed." "The war," she repeated softly. "Sometimes I forget how much we don't know about each other yet." "Yet." The word hung between them, full of promise and possibility. "The men who attacked the marshal," Frank said, changing the subject, "they mentioned Harlan Vickers." Olivia's expression darkened. "Vickers owns the big spread north of town. He's been pressuring smaller ranchers to sell out, claiming water rights that aren't his. The marshal was investigating complaints." The scenario was all too familiar to Frank. "And now the marshal is out of commission." "For several weeks at least," Olivia confirmed, "which leaves Silverdale vulnerable." Frank's jaw tightened. "Where's the marshal's deputy?" "Went to fetch the territorial marshal for backup." Won't be back for days, she studied his face. What are you thinking, Frank? He was thinking about fire and ash, about homes destroyed and lives uprooted by men who took what they wanted through violence. He was thinking about how Silverdale, with its close-knit community and honest people, deserved better. I'm thinking I might need to extend my stay a bit longer, he said quietly. The following morning, Frank rode out to the Rollins farm where the injured boy was recovering. As he'd suspected, the family had already received visitors, 2 men working for Vickers, suggesting that with the marshal indisposed, it might be a good time to consider selling their small cattle operation. They weren't threatening exactly, Mrs. Rollins explained as she poured coffee at her kitchen table. Just insistent, said water would be scarce this summer and Vickers could guarantee access for the right price. Frank nodded, his expression neutral even as anger simmered beneath. Have they approached other farms? The Hendersons, the Wilsons, any place that relies on Coyote Creek for water, she sighed. Folks are worried without Marshal Peterson. I understand, Frank assured her. Thank you for the information. As he rode back to town, Frank's mind worked through the familiar pattern. Vickers was making his move while law enforcement was weakened. Soon, the subtle pressure would become more overt, cattle driven through crops, fences cut, watering holes mysteriously fouled. He'd seen the tactics before, had lived through their consequences. But Silverdale wasn't his home. These weren't his battles to fight. And yet, as he approached the town, his eyes were drawn to the doctor's house, where Olivia would be tending to the marshal. In less than a week, she had somehow breached the walls he'd built around his heart, awakening feelings he'd thought buried with his family. The connection he felt with her defied explanation. It was as if they had known each other in some previous existence, their souls recognizing each other across time itself. It was foolish, irrational, and yet undeniable. Frank made his decision. He would stay, at least until the deputy returned with reinforcements. He would protect what these people had built, would stand against the kind of men who had taken everything from him once before. He found Olivia changing the marshal's bandages. The lawman was conscious now, though weak, his weathered face creased with pain and frustration. Vickers won't wait, Peterson rasped when Frank entered. Been looking for an opportunity like this. His men are already making rounds, Frank confirmed, sharing what he'd learned from Mrs. Rollins. The marshal attempted to sit up, wincing sharply. Need to get word to the territorial office. Deputies already gone for help, Olivia reminded him, gently pressing him back against the pillows. Won't be soon enough, Peterson insisted. Vickers has 15 hired guns. He'll move before help arrives. Frank exchanged a glance with Olivia, seeing the concern in her eyes. I'll gather the town council, she said. We need to organize. That evening, the small town hall was packed with anxious faces. Storekeepers, farmers, and ranchers crowded together as Olivia explained the situation. Frank stood at the back, observing the community he'd inadvertently become part of. We need to select an interim marshal, one of the council members suggested. Someone to maintain order until Deputy Reeves returns. Eyes turned toward Frank, and he felt a sudden discomfort at the attention. He had no intention of wearing a badge, of taking on official responsibility. Mr. Jameson has experience, Dr. Zimmerman noted. And he's already familiar with the situation. Before Frank could protest, Olivia spoke up. I don't think an official appointment is necessary. What we need is organization, a plan to protect our properties and water rights. She looked directly at Frank. Though we would welcome Mr. Jameson's expertise. Relief washed through him at her understanding. He stepped forward. I've seen situations like this before. Vickers won't want an all-out war, too visible, too likely to bring territorial authorities down on him. He'll use intimidation, isolated incidents to pressure the vulnerable. So what do we do? Asked a weathered rancher. We watch out for each other, Frank replied simply. No one rides alone, properties are patrolled in shifts. Any sign of trouble, send for help immediately. The meeting continued as they worked out logistics, assigning patrols and establishing signals. Throughout the discussion, Frank was acutely aware of Olivia's presence, her practical suggestions, her calm reassurance to worried neighbors. She was the heart of this community, he realized, trusted, respected, essential. As the meeting broke up, Olivia approached him. You spoke well, people trust you already. Frank shook his head. I'm just passing through, remember. A small smile curved her lips. Are you? It's been nearly a week now. He had no response to that because the truth was, he no longer thought of himself as just passing through. Something had shifted fundamentally and irrevocably. Walk me home, she asked softly. The night air was crisp as they strolled through the quiet streets, their steps naturally falling into rhythm together. You didn't want them to make you marshal, Olivia observed. No, Frank admitted. I've spent 3 years avoiding responsibility for anyone but myself. Hard habit to break. And yet here you are, helping organize the town's defense. She glanced at him. Actions speak louder than intentions, Frank Jameson. They paused at her gate, the doctor's house dark except for a single lamp burning in the front window. In the silver moonlight, Olivia's face was luminous, her eyes reflecting the stars above them. I keep thinking about what you said, Frank murmured, about souls recognizing each other. Olivia stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. What if it's true? What if we've met before in some other time, some other place? Then I suspect, he said softly, that I loved you then too. The words slipped out before he could stop them, honest and unguarded. Olivia's breath caught, and for a moment Frank feared he'd crossed a line, moved too quickly, but then she reached up, her hand gently touching his cheek. I believe you did, she whispered. Just as I believe I loved you. Frank leaned down, drawn by a force as inevitable as gravity itself, and his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deepening as something ancient and familiar sparked between them. It felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding a truth he'd always known but somehow forgotten. When they finally parted, Olivia's eyes were bright with emotion. Promise me something, she said, her voice barely audible. Anything, he replied without hesitation. Promise me you won't face Vickers alone. Whatever happens, we face it together. Frank nodded, knowing it was a promise he would keep. For the first time in 3 years, the thought of having someone to protect, someone who would stand beside him rather than behind him, didn't feel like weakness. It felt like strength. The next morning, Frank woke to the sound of urgent knocking. He'd taken a room at the boarding house, no longer comfortable with the noisy saloon accommodations. Opening the door, he found one of the Henderson boys, breathless and agitated. Mr. Jameson, they cut our fence last night. Pa's found tracks leading back toward Vickers' ranch. Frank dressed quickly and rode out with the boy. Sure enough, a section of the Hendersons' fence had been cut, allowing a neighboring rancher's cattle to trample through a field of young wheat. It was a classic tactic, damage that seemed accidental but sent a clear message. They'll deny it, mister. Henderson said grimly as they surveyed the damage, but we know who's behind it. Frank nodded. Don't repair this section yet. I want Marshal Peterson to see it when he's well enough. Document everything, the tracks, the damage. Throughout the day, reports came in of similar incidents across the area. A watering hole fouled with dead animals, threatening notes left on doors, cattle scattered from their grazing areas. Vickers was applying pressure systematically, testing Silverdale's resolve. That evening, as Frank discussed the situation with Olivia and her father over dinner, a gunshot echoed from the direction of the main street. They rushed outside to find a crowd gathering in front of the saloon. On the wooden sidewalk lay one of the town's ranchers, blood seeping from a wound in his side. Madison accused me of cheating, the wounded man gasped as doctor. Zimmerman examined him, drew on me without warning. Madison works for Vickers, someone in the crowd muttered. Frank scanned the faces, noting the tension, the anger building. This was how violence escalated, one incident leading to another until the situation spiraled beyond control. Where's Madison now? He asked. Rode out after the shooting, the barkeeper replied. Headed north. Toward Vickers' ranch, Olivia concluded, her eyes meeting Frank's. The wounded man was carried to the doctor's house while Frank called a hasty meeting of the town leaders. This is deliberate provocation, he explained. Vickers wants us to react, to give him an excuse for more violence. So we do nothing, one man demanded angrily. We defend but don't attack, Frank clarified. Double the patrols. No one confronts Vickers or his men alone. We document everything for the territorial authorities. After the meeting, Frank found himself once again walking Olivia home through the quiet streets. The events of the day had left them both tense, preoccupied. It's going to get worse before it gets better, she observed as they reached her door. Frank nodded grimly. Vickers is testing our resolve. When he finds we won't be intimidated easily, he'll escalate. Olivia's hand found his in the darkness. You've seen this before, not just with your family but others. During the war and after, he confirmed. Men like Vickers are the same everywhere. They mistake decency for weakness, community for vulnerability. She studied his face in the dim light spilling from the house. You're different than you were when you arrived. How so? You're engaged now. Connected, her fingers tightened around his. You speak of we and our, not just yourself. Frank realized she was right. Somewhere in the past week, his careful isolation had crumbled, replaced by a sense of responsibility, of belonging. And at the center of that transformation was Olivia herself, her strength, her compassion, her unwavering belief in connections that transcended understanding. I still don't understand it, he admitted. This feeling that I've known you before. Olivia smiled softly. Perhaps we don't need to understand it, perhaps we just need to trust it. She rose on her tiptoes, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips. Good night, Frank Jameson. Try to get some rest. But rest proved elusive that night. Frank lay awake, thinking of Olivia, of Silverdale, of the confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. For the first time in 3 years, he had found something, someone worth fighting for. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. The next day brought news that changed everything. Olivia burst into the general store where Frank was helping organize supplies, her face flushed with urgency. Vickers has dammed Coyote Creek, she announced without preamble. He's cut off water to the southern farms completely. Frank's jaw tightened. It was an aggressive move, one that threatened not just livelihoods but lives. Without water, crops would fail, livestock would suffer, and the smaller ranches would be forced to sell at whatever price Vickers offered. Has anyone verified this? He asked. Olivia nodded. The Wilson boys rode up to check when their stream dried up. They saw armed men guarding a newly built dam. News spread quickly through the town, and by midday, a group of angry ranchers had gathered, armed and ready to confront Vickers directly. This is what he wants, Frank warned them. An excuse for open violence. We need to wait for the territorial marshal. Wait for what? Demanded Henderson. For our cattle to die of thirst, for our crops to wither. Vickers has declared war, and I say we answer. Frank could see the logic in their anger, the desperate need to act. But he also saw the trap Vickers had laid, provoke an attack, then claim self-defense when he unleashed his superior numbers against them. It was Olivia who found the solution. We don't attack, she said, her voice cutting through the angry murmurs. We petition. Every property owner affected by the damming signs a formal complaint. Frank takes it to Vickers with witnesses, respectable witnesses, including my father. And if he refuses, someone called out. Then we have documented his refusal through proper channels, she replied. When the territorial marshal arrives, Vickers can't claim he was attacked without provocation. The simplicity and legality of her approach calmed the crowd. By evening, a petition had been drafted and signed by every affected landowner. Frank, along with Dr. Zimmerman and 2 of the town council members, would deliver it the following morning. That night, as they sat on the porch swing at the doctor's house, Olivia's hand found Frank's, their fingers intertwining naturally. I'm worried about tomorrow, she admitted, her usual confidence momentarily subdued. Frank squeezed her hand gently. Your father and the others will be with me. Vickers won't risk harming respected citizens in broad daylight. And yet I can't shake this feeling of dread. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. Promise me you'll be careful. I promise, he said, bringing her hand to his lips. I have too much to come back for. The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. In just over a week, Olivia Zimmerman had become the center of Frank's world, a beacon calling him back from the lonely wilderness he'd wandered for 3 years. I've been thinking, he said slowly, about staying. In Silverdale. Her eyes widened. For how long? Frank's gaze held her steadily. For good, if there's a reason to. Olivia's breath caught. Are you asking me if there's a reason, Frank Jameson? I suppose I am, he replied, suddenly feeling as nervous as a schoolboy. Her answer was to lean forward and kiss him, a kiss full of promise and certainty. There is, she whispered against his lips, there absolutely is. The ride to Vickers Ranch the next morning was tense but uneventful. Frank led the small delegation, the petition secure in his saddlebag. Dr. Zimmerman rode beside him, along with Councilman Harper and Mr. Reynolds, the town banker. They were a deliberately non-threatening group, chosen for their standing in the community. Vickers Ranch was impressive, a sprawling main house surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings, corrals full of quality horses, and vast herds of cattle grazing on the surrounding grasslands. It spoke of wealth, of power, of ambition unfettered by consideration for others. They were met at the gate by armed men who escorted them to the main house. Harlan Vickers himself awaited them on the porch, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and cold eyes that assessed them with calculating precision. "Gentlemen," he greeted them without warmth, "to what do I owe this visit?" Frank dismounted, the others following suit. "Mr. Vickers, we come representing the landowners and citizens of Silverdale. We have a petition regarding the damming of Coyote Creek." Vickers' expression didn't change. "Coyote Creek runs through my property." "It does," Dr. Zimmerman agreed cordially. "But water rights in this territory are governed by prior appropriation law. The downstream users have established claims that predate your purchase of this ranch." Frank handed the petition to Vickers, who took it with obvious reluctance. "This document formally requests that you remove the dam and restore water flow to the properties listed. It's signed by all affected parties." Vickers glanced at the paper, then back at Frank, his gaze sharpening. "You're not from Silverdale. Who exactly are you?" "Frank Jameson. I'm assisting Marshal Peterson while he recovers from his injury." "Ah," Vickers said, a cold smile touching his lips. "The drifter who's taken a shine to the doctor's daughter." The personal reference to Olivia sent a chill down Frank's spine. Vickers was making it clear he had eyes and ears in town, that he knew more than he should about Frank himself. "This isn't about me," Frank replied evenly. "It's about water rights legally established under territorial law." Vickers studied the petition for another moment, then without warning tore it in half, letting the pieces flutter to the ground. "Here's my response," he said coldly. "This is my land, that's my water. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with my men." He gestured to the armed cowboys who had gathered around them. "Or they can sell to me at fair market value and avoid further inconvenience." "Doctor," Zimmerman stepped forward, his dignity unruffled by the hostility. "Mr. Vickers, I urge you to reconsider. The territorial marshal will take a dim view of your actions when he arrives." "When he arrives," Vickers echoed mockingly. "That could be days from now. A lot can happen in a few days, Doctor." His gaze shifted back to Frank. "Especially to those who insert themselves into matters that don't concern them." The threat was unmistakable. Frank maintained his composure, but inside, anger burned hot and fierce. "We've delivered our message. Your response is noted." As they mounted their horses to leave, Vickers called after them. "One more thing, Jameson. That fire that took your family in Kansas, terrible tragedy, would hate to see history repeat itself." Frank froze, ice replacing the fire in his veins. Vickers knew about his past, about the most painful chapter of his life. And he had just threatened to recreate it. The ride back to Silverdale was silent, each man absorbed in his own thoughts. Frank's mind raced with the implications of Vickers' threat. The man had resources, connections that extended beyond the territory. He'd investigated Frank's background, which meant he saw him as a threat worth eliminating. Back in town, they reported the outcome to the waiting citizens. Anger and fear rippled through the crowd as they explained Vickers' response. "So we fight," Henderson declared, others nodding in agreement. "No," Frank said firmly, "that's exactly what he wants. We defend our properties, protect each other, but we don't attack. The deputy should return with the territorial marshal within days." But as the meeting dispersed, Frank pulled Olivia aside. "Vickers knows about my family," he said quietly. "He made it clear the threat extends to you, to anyone I care about." Alarm flashed across her face. "He threatened me." Not directly, but the implication was clear. Frank's hands tightened on her shoulders. "I think you and your father should leave town until this is resolved." Olivia's expression hardened with determination. "I'm not leaving, Frank. Neither is my father. This is our home." "Olivia." "No," she interrupted firmly. 3 years ago you weren't there when your family needed you. I understand why that haunts you. But I'm telling you now, running isn't the answer. Not for me and not for you anymore." Her words struck him with the force of revelation. She was right. His greatest regret, his deepest pain, was that he hadn't been there to protect his family. He'd been absent at the critical moment, and that absence had shaped every decision since. "I can't lose you," he said simply, the admission laying bare the depth of his feelings. Olivia's expression softened. "Then stay and fight beside me, not just for me but for all of us. For the home you could have here." In that moment Frank Jameson made his decision. No more running, no more isolation. He would stand with these people, with this woman, against whatever came. That night, as a precaution, Frank stayed at the doctor's house, sleeping on a cot in the parlor. His instincts told him Vickers wouldn't wait long to make his move, and he wanted to be close to Olivia when it happened. He was right. Shortly after midnight, the smell of smoke roused him from a light sleep. Outside, flames were already engulfing the livery stable, and shadowy figures moved through the darkness, setting more fires throughout the town. "Olivia," Frank called, rushing to wake her and her father. "Fire, the town's burning." They scrambled to dress as Frank grabbed his gun belt and rifle. "Get to the church," he instructed. "It's stone, won't burn easily. I'll spread the alarm." The next hours were chaos. As Silverdale's citizens fought the fires, Vickers' men attacked from the shadows, shooting at those who tried to organize bucket brigades. Frank moved through the mayhem, directing defenses, helping evacuate homes in the fire's path, and returning fire when necessary. By dawn, much of the town's commercial district lay in smoldering ruins. The livery, the saloon, 2 stores, and several homes had been destroyed. Miraculously, no lives had been lost, though several people had been injured, including Henderson, who'd taken a bullet in the arm while defending his family. The survivors gathered at the church, exhausted, soot-stained, and grimly determined. Olivia moved among them, treating injuries alongside her father, her face streaked with ash but her movements steady and sure. Frank watched her with a mixture of pride and fear. She embodied everything that was worth fighting for: courage, compassion, a refusal to surrender to intimidation. And in that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he loved her, not just as a man loves a woman, but as a soul recognizes its other half. "They'll be back," he told the assembled townspeople. "Vickers thinks this will break you, force you to sell and leave. He's counting on your fear." "What do you suggest, Doctor?" Zimmerman asked, his medical bag open beside him as he stitched a gash on a man's forehead. Frank surveyed the faces around him, tired, afraid, but resolute. "We fortify what's left, establish defensive positions. And we prepare to stand our ground." "Against 15 gunmen?" someone questioned. "Against however many it takes," Frank replied firmly. "The territorial marshal will come. We just need to hold until then." As the townspeople organized into defensive groups, Frank pulled Olivia aside. In the relative privacy of the church vestry, he took both her hands in his. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I want to build something here, with you." Her eyes widened slightly. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Frank Jameson?" "I'm not doing it properly," he admitted with a small smile. "No ring, no bended knee, but yes, Olivia Zimmerman, I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife." Joy broke through the exhaustion on her face. "I would consider it very favorably indeed," she replied, leaning forward to press a quick, fierce kiss to his lips. "But first, we have a town to defend." The defensive preparations continued throughout the morning. The remaining buildings were fortified, and lookouts were posted at strategic points around town. Frank organized the men with firearms into groups, positioning them to cover the main approaches to Silverdale. By midday, a tense waiting had settled over the town. Vickers' next move was inevitable, but the timing uncertain. Frank found himself beside Dr. Zimmerman, both men checking rifles as they kept watch from the church tower. "You love my daughter," the doctor said matter-of-factly. Frank nodded. "Yes, sir, I've asked her to marry me once this is resolved." Dr. Zimmerman was quiet for a moment. "When my wife died, I thought I would never recover. Olivia was the only thing that kept me going." He glanced at Frank. "I've watched you this past week. You're a good man, Jameson, better than you give yourself credit for." "I've made mistakes," Frank admitted. "We all have." The doctor's gaze returned to the horizon. "But it's what we do next that defines us." Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from one of the lookouts. Riders were approaching from the north, at least 20 men, Vickers at their head. "They're here," Frank said grimly, raising his spyglass to confirm what he already knew. Vickers had brought his full force, intending to end the resistance once and for all. Word spread quickly through the defensive positions. Women and children were moved to the most secure buildings, while those who could fight took their assigned posts. Frank found Olivia helping organize medical supplies in the church. "Stay inside," he urged her, "no matter what you hear." She met his gaze steadily. "Be careful, I expect you to keep your promise about our future." He kissed her quickly, then moved to take his position at the barricade erected across the main street. Beside him, Henderson checked his rifle, his wounded arm in a sling. "Never thought I'd die defending a town I only meant to pass through," Frank commented dryly. Henderson gave him a sidelong look. "Never thought we'd have a drifter worth following either. Funny how things work out." The riders halted just outside rifle range. Vickers, clearly visible at the front, raised a hand signaling for attention. "Citizens of Silverdale," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "I regret last night's unpleasantness, but it demonstrates what happens when you refuse reasonable offers. I'm here to give you one last chance. Leave now, abandon your claims, and you can go in peace. Stay, and I cannot guarantee your safety." Frank stood, making himself visible above the barricade. "We're not leaving, Vickers. This town isn't yours to take." Vickers' expression hardened. "You've made your choice then." He turned to his men. "Take the town. Anyone who resists is fair game." What followed was a battle unlike anything Silverdale had ever seen. Vickers' men charged the barricades, guns blazing. The defenders returned fire from their positions, determined to protect what remained of their community. Frank moved from position to position, encouraging, directing, fighting alongside men who days ago had been strangers but now stood as brothers. Despite being outnumbered, the townspeople had the advantage of defensive positions and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The first assault was repelled, though not without cost. 2 defenders were wounded, and one of Vickers' men lay dead in the street. The attackers retreated to regroup, and a tense lull settled over the battlefield. "They'll try to flank us next," Frank predicted, checking his ammunition. "Henderson, take 4 men and reinforce the east side. Wilson, watch the south approach." As the defenders adjusted their positions, Frank caught movement from the corner of his eye, riders approaching from the west. For a moment his heart sank, thinking Vickers had called in more reinforcements. Then he heard Henderson's whoop of joy. "It's the marshal. The territorial marshals arrived." Sure enough, a dozen men in territorial police uniforms rode into view, the deputy at their head. Relief washed through Frank as the newcomers quickly assessed the situation and moved to surround Vickers and his men. The territorial marshal, a weathered man named Harkins, confronted Vickers directly. "Harlan Vickers, you're under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and illegal seizure of water rights." Vickers' face contorted with rage. "This is my land. These people are trespassers." "Save it for the judge," Marshal Harkins replied coldly. "Your men are surrounded. Order them to drop their weapons." For a moment it seemed Vickers might resist even these odds. His hand hovered near his pistol, his eyes wild with thwarted ambition. Then slowly, calculating even in defeat, he raised his hands. "Do as he says," he ordered his men, his voice tight with suppressed fury. As the territorial police disarmed and arrested Vickers and his gunmen, the citizens of Silverdale emerged from their defensive positions, disbelieving joy spreading through their ranks. The nightmare was over. Frank stood watching as Vickers was led away in handcuffs, their eyes meeting briefly across the dusty street. There was hatred in the older man's gaze, but also a grudging acknowledgement. He had underestimated both Frank and the town he had chosen to defend. Olivia appeared at Frank's side, her hand slipping into his. "It's over," she said softly. Frank nodded, feeling the weight of the past 3 years, the grief, the isolation, the aimless wandering begin to lift. "Not over," he corrected gently. "Just beginning." In the weeks that followed, Silverdale began the process of rebuilding. The physical reconstruction was challenging but straightforward. Buildings could be rebuilt, fences mended, crops replanted. More significant was the strengthening of community bonds forged in adversity. Frank found himself at the center of these efforts, his leadership during the crisis having earned him the respect and trust of the townspeople. When Marshal Peterson officially retired, citing his injury and advancing age, the town council unanimously voted to offer Frank the position. "I'm no lawman," he protested when Olivia told him of their decision. She smiled, adjusting the ribbon on her hair as they prepared for Sunday services. "You're what this town needs, someone who understands both justice and mercy." Their wedding took place on a perfect autumn day, the newly rebuilt church filled with townsfolk who had become family. Dr. Zimmerman proudly walked his daughter down the aisle to where Frank waited, scarcely able to believe his good fortune. Olivia was radiant in a gown of ivory silk, her chestnut hair adorned with wildflowers. When she reached him, her hazel eyes meeting his with that same inexplicable recognition that had struck them both upon first meeting, Frank felt a certainty that transcended understanding. Whatever connection had drawn them together, across time, across lives perhaps, it was real and it was theirs to cherish. "I take you, Olivia, to be my wife," he vowed, his voice steady with conviction. "To share all that may come, to find home in each other when the world grows harsh, to love you in this life and whatever may follow." Her answering vows were equally heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers from the congregation reflected not just celebration of their union, but joy in the town's survival and renewal. That evening, as they sat on the porch of what was now their home, the doctor having gifted them the house as a wedding present while he took smaller quarters closer to his office, Olivia rested her head against Frank's shoulder. "I still feel it sometimes," she murmured, "that strange certainty that we've known each other before." Frank's arm tightened around her. "Perhaps we have, in another time, another place. And found each other again in this life," she concluded, satisfaction in her voice. "I like that thought." "Whatever the explanation," Frank said, "I'm grateful for it, and for you." He looked out at the town spread before them, at the new buildings rising from the ashes of destruction, at the community that had welcomed a lonely drifter and given him purpose. "3 years ago, I thought the frontier was no place for love. That attachment was a weakness I couldn't afford." Olivia lifted her head to meet his gaze. "And now?" "Now I know that love is the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile," he replied simply. "The frontier isn't just about survival, it's about building something lasting, something meaningful, and that can't be done alone." As twilight settled over Silverdale, Frank Jameson held his wife close, grateful for whatever mysterious force had brought them together. He had come to this town believing he was just passing through, a drifter with no connections and no future. Instead, he had found his place, his purpose, and the other half of his soul in a woman who had looked at him like she knew him from another life. And perhaps she had, perhaps they both had. But what mattered now was this life, this love, and the future they would build together on the frontier that had once seemed so hostile to hope.